Well, hello everyone. Yeah, today we're talking about Mircea Eliade. Hopefully, I got that right. The book is Myth and Reality, I think. Is that right, Judith? I think that's the name of the book, Myth and Reality.
I'm not really sure, sorry, but this is obviously a chapter in it.
It's the chapter.
Mythologies of, yeah, mythologies of memory and forgetting.
Yes, and just quickly, I'd never heard of Eliade, and that's what we were just discussing now, prior to this. That some of you had, Judith had. Me and Lorraine were kind of, it's new to us, but it was cool. Basically, Eliade had fluent command of five languages. That's amazing. Romanian, French, German, Italian, English, and a reading knowledge of three others: Hebrew, Persian, and Sanskrit. Uh, that's pretty amazing. So, obviously, a very brilliant person, historian of religion, who's a fiction writer, philosopher, and professor at the University of Chicago. One of the most influential scholars of religion of the 20th century, an interpreter of religious experience. He established paradigms in religious studies that persist to this day. Wow, what a what a giant! Just reading this one chapter too. I'll say something about it first. I loved it, and it's right up my alley because for me, I really enjoy the kind of that kind of I don't know, how would you put it? It's not like dry academia at all, is it? There's a lot of weaving together different narratives and different mythologies. It's a lovely, beautiful blend, I find, of philosophy and mythology and kind of some of the more interesting aspects of esoteric religions in particular, or the esoteric parts of the religions. So fascinating. Yeah, I loved it. I'm definitely going to read more of this. What did you think, Judith?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right that he blends a lot of different cultural traditions together. And one of the amazing things about him was that he actually went and studied in India under Indian academics. And it's not just that he was in an armchair in Europe kind of pontificating about Eastern traditions. He actually went there and learnt them and the languages, such as Sanskrit, from scholars working in India at the time, which was must have been pretty revolutionary in the 30s, and demonstrating a real commitment to exploring other traditions.
Awesome. What did you think, Lorraine? Just as a
Well, when I first set off, I thought, oh, I'm not sure I like this. Then I got halfway through, and then I thought, oh, I think I do like this. And so the further I went on, the more I enjoyed it. Mm.
and it's such an innovative voice, isn't it? Like it's a unique take. And
Mm.
when I was younger, I used to read a lot of Milan Kundera, and he plays around with these myths as well in his fiction. So for example, he even wrote a book called Laughter and Forgetting. I think that was called, and his very famous book, what is it? The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which got turned into a movie. But that starts out with a in the first section of the book with a description of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, and the story captures that theme of memory and forgetting and return. And I just find that such an evocative theme because I don't know about you guys, but it's something that I actually do reflect on, like noticing these kind of cycles of return. And I don't know, like I don't want to sound like a madman, but it's almost like these kind of I can see a place for this esoteric symbology that sort of creeps into your life when significant moments kind of creep back into your life that have been, that have been there before, and maybe it's like, oh, this is a second chance to have a look at it. It's kind of I find that quite a fascinating phenomenon. Do you guys know what I'm talking about, or am I just weird?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and just reflecting on this chapter, I've been thinking about the importance of memory and forgetting in culture, right? So in a sense, you can't have culture without memory. You can't have, and just to refer back to our recent session on AI, I'll start to think that AIs are, this is like a kind of a new Turing test, right? The AIs are approaching humanity if they, for instance, decide to emigrate from Austin, Texas to the ancestral home in Silicon Valley because they remember the traditions from. So basically, remembering tradition, culture, history, all these things are impossible without memory. And this is why it's so central to, well, it's central to personal identity, right? None of us is who we are without our having memory of who we were. And one of the tragedies of dementia and aging can be the loss of personal identity through memory, and the sort of the recurrence that has to take place every minute of a day. So yeah, memory is so central to both individual and cultural identity. Yeah, it's no surprise that it's formed such a sort of an evocative part of all these myth traditions.
Yeah, beautiful. And also the idea of, and I think this will come into it, recollection and the kind of themes that surround it, like recognition and I don't know. There's these ideas of how memory actually works. Is it through recognition, or is it through resemblance of something that we already knew in the past? Like, yeah. So, well, why don't we jump in at the right at the start? He's telling this Indian story, right? The amnesia of Matsyendranath. Matsyendranath. And the story is about a yogi who falls in love with the queen and forgets his identity. Yep. So once enslaved, he's destined to die, but his disciple goes to rescue him. And in the process, he disguises himself as a dancing girl, and he sings enigmatic songs through which the master begins to remember himself. And the master understands that the way of the flesh leads to death, that his oblivion was basically forgetfulness of his true and immortal nature, and that the charms of Kadali, which is the place he ended up in, represent the mirages of profane life. The master's forgetfulness, Eliade tells us, is assimilated to death, and vice versa. His awakening, his anamnesis is a prerequisite for immortality. In this too, I was really taken back to the symposium. Did you draw those sort of connections, Judith or Lorraine?
Yeah, 100%. It's such well, as Eliade draws out later on, it's such a key idea in Plato. But just to make a connection, where it's the songs of the servant disguised as the dancing girl which bring the master back to some remembrance, and it just struck me that's a really interesting highlight as well, because talking about people affected by dementia, often it's through music that they do make connections. It's funny that it's that kind of something about those parts of the brain, I suppose, or those parts of the identity. Somehow the music manages to trigger it. But yeah, so there's this idea around well, obviously the forgetfulness is identified with a kind of a death, because yeah, it's a kind of a death of an identity. But yeah, it was really interesting, I think, how Eliade singled out the key elements of this kind of tale, the state of amnesia and the sort of the coming back and the awakening. And so he makes the link with Gnostic kind of traditions. I suppose to say from the outset, though, there are questions, I suppose, around method in terms of, well, this is what we find in Indian tradition, and this is what we find in Gnostic tradition, and making you know, bringing them together in certain ways. And this was kind of, I suppose, a way that comparative mythology was done, I would say towards the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Now, I guess there's always got to be methodological questions about whether that's a really sound way of proceeding. And I think perhaps earlier ways of doing this kind of thing. So, for instance, I understand one of the works that was influential on Eliade was Sir James Fraser's very influential work, The Golden Bough, from the 1890s, which again tried to, you know, bring a lot of mythological traditions together and find commonalities. But that was already a bit of a quixotic project, and we can see that in the novel Middlemarch, which came out in the 1870s by George Eliot, and in that there's a scholar whose project is the key to all the mythologies, and yeah, it's presented as a quixotic project that has no end and it's got no boundaries, and it's kind of it consumes people. So I guess what I'm saying is, I suppose we've got to be a little bit careful around the methodology that Eliade brings here. I mean, he's obviously very knowledgeable, and I think he identifies himself later on. What is kind of key here is it's a search for the origins, right? It's a search for where all these things come from and where they all connect. So I guess as long as we have a little bit of caution around some of the connections that he makes, that's all. Yeah, that's all the point I want to make there.
Yeah. He doesn't mention it, but I was obviously looking at this with a contrasting eye to, say, Stoicism, you know, couldn't help myself. But and it was a good contrast. It made me realize that at least the Indian mythology and the Gnostic mythology, as it's presented here, has a similarity in that the ultimate self, somehow the soul or the Atman or whatever, is transformed into a material body through some sort of desire to experience the flesh, and then as a result forgets its ultimate nature. So I saw that as the way he kind of groups those, as opposed to other kinds of mythologies. I don't think Indian mythology is, well, religion is dualistic, so I wouldn't say that, but there's that theme of the self forgetting itself through incarnation, I think. But to go back to the symposium link, it's because the yogi, like the soul, forgets itself because he falls in love. And so I think that's the same with the way Plato plays around with Socrates in the Symposium, because it's about love, and the people who are presumably asleep in the story are the ones who don't understand love, and the one who's awake is the master who understands the true nature of love, and then he plays around with the concept of love in order to wake them up, just as the dancer is probably playing around with the concept of love in a similar way, but probably using esoteric words and movements and things like that, because it's a different tradition. That's what I thought was an interesting connection. Looks like Sam's just arriving. But you're right. He then quickly introduces that Gnostic connection.
I found it interesting. I mean, I went off a complete different tangent to you two, but I mean, for me, it seemed like physical love, or at least love with a woman, was corrupting of the self. That was almost underneath it, which reminded me a little bit of Adam and Eve, this corrupting woman who uses sort of charms. She's almost a snake. And then you had the snake charming dancer to bring him back. But what I found interesting was there's this notion of a loss of self. So in that connection, there's a loss of self. But that in of itself implies that there was a self that was known before in order to lose it. And I'm not certain that there was a self before, a known self, for you to have amnesia of the loss of self. So I find that an interesting kind of circular contradiction in it. That's the way I went with that bit anyway.
Well, that is very interesting. I presume in these mythologies, there's this idea, or religions, that prior to birth, you do know yourself to be what you actually are, like whatever it is, the divine mind or a soul, or in Plato, right? It's the soul that has knowledge of the real world, you know, the world of forms. Um, and that's what apparently the religion is telling us, that there's a spiritual dimension to life prior to birth, and that when we're born, we somehow forget it.
Yeah, I think they say that later on, that there's almost this wiped self, as though memory is lost either on death or through the process of rebirth, I think they go on to say. So it's either one of those, which I found quite convenient to explain
Yeah.
no memory.
Yeah.
So it
Hi, Sam.
that well with me. That's
Yeah.
Oh, he's
Is
gone.
Sam there? Yeah, and I think you're right, Lorraine, because I think there's a lot of ambiguity around this idea of the self, and I think there's a lot of well, there's certainly a huge literature in the Greco-Roman context around, well, when did an idea of the self emerge? Did Seneca discover the self? That's one idea. Or is it completely anachronistic and that we're imposing a category on the ancients that they actually didn't have? So yeah, I think you're right to be cautious around statements around the self and consciousness of self. I think we do well to be a little cautious around that. So Sam, are you here? We saw you come, we saw you go.
I think he's still connecting. But you know, this
Still
idea of
connected.
self, I think Eliade is not talking about what we normally mean by self. So, like he says here, he's talking about the pan-Indian motif of the fall of the spirit into the circle of existences, and as a consequence, loss of consciousness of the self. So it's a cosmic self, isn't it? It's not an ego self. And yeah, so, and then he says there's these metaphors of binding, chaining, and captivity, which are interchanged with those of forgetting, knowing, and sleep to signify the human condition. Yeah, it's a strange idea, but yeah,
it is, and that idea of a cosmic self, once again I get trapped in that, because it suggests a singularity, a self, whereas cosmic implies something way bigger and much more universal. So I kind of went, how do we separate those two out? As this spirit entity that is a self contained in and of itself, but it's part of a cosmic thing, but it's not the cosmic. It's so I kind of wonder, well, what does he mean by that?
that's a very interesting point. We could unpack that, because he gives us a clue here. He says in this Indian text, the Dijhanikaya, I don't know, that the gods fall from heaven when their memory fails and they are of confused memory. On the contrary, those gods who do not forget are immutable, eternal, of a nature that knows no change. My understanding of that is there seems to be parts of the cosmos that get sucked into becoming, and they enter the world of change, the temporal world, and so they take on a self. But there are some parts of the cosmos, these other gods, that never enter that process of becoming and only exist as being. And so they always remain immutable and eternal and never have any problems with forgetting what they are. I mean, that's how I read that. It's very complex. Would you like to try and unpack that a bit, Judith? Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, that seems quite plausible to me. Again, we've got to take Eliade on trust, I think, here, because we're not familiar with the original text. He was. So yeah, we've kind of got to go with his interpretation. But yeah, I think you're right, Courtney, insofar as you're making the connection that it's the gods who are um, who are immutable. And again, that recalls a little bit Stoicism, right? It's the sage who is immutable, constant in every respect. He's the perfect one. So yes, forgetting is one of the aspects in which the non-godlike are fallible and therefore liable to fall into error or fall into some kind of trouble. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And there was some talk about this sort of stuff in Nussbaum's book. Not exactly this, but along similar lines when she's talking about the different schools and she talks about how the gods relate to man. So, you know, there's that famous line in Epictetus where he says there's 5 different types of God, you know, according to the traditions. Can't remember what they all were, but they're basically the Aristotelian one, the Epicurean one, the skeptic one, and the one that he agrees with, which he says something like, "And I can't even move without without God knowing everything that I'm doing," basically. But the other idea is that the Epicurean God may be one of these remote kind of immutable gods that has no interest in humans whatsoever. But again, that's a slightly different story from the one he's telling us here, because what he's telling us here is that according to Gnosticism and this Indian kind of way of looking at things, human beings, our own consciousness is a god, you know, that's forgotten itself. And do you remember, was it Joseph Campbell did that dodgy book called Hero with a Thousand Faces? And I think people like Alan Watts used the same idea, that what if reality was God just playing a game of hide and seek with himself? You know, he kind of incarnates himself and forgets so that he can have fun. I don't know why he would want to have fun, but, you know, basically kind of go through the drama of being an ignorant human being, because knowing everything, being God all the time must get pretty boring and stale. I don't know. It's very anthropomorphic, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see kind of Eliade's drawing parallels between remembering, being conscious, being being sighted, because he draws the contrast with the blindfolded. So yeah, these are all kind of different ways of understanding the same condition, I guess, or the same contrast between the sighted and the blind, the dead and the living, the forgetting and the remembering.
Hey, Sam, you finally got through. You've got 2 windows up now, for some reason.
It's because I'm on my phone. The computer's very unstable.
Ah, there you go. What did you think of? Does anyone remember how to say it? Eliade?
Eli- Eliade? Yes. I think that analogy of falling. Sorry, he takes it in. He takes a few different paradigms. The initial one, where the living fall into death and dissolve, and then that is a type of bondage, or a type of blocking, or a type of both it's a loss of identity or a vice. I think that's coherent. I think it's the same, really. They just talk about the same. It's like if you're describing your shoes as you're marching compared to describing where you're going. You know, they're 2 analogies that are the same process.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we were sort of just unpacking that, the how cryptic it is. I did like that story that you were just mentioning, Judith, from the Chandogya Upanishad, and the commentary of that man who got blindfolded and he got lost, apparently, in trying to find his way back to the village, as some sort of metaphor of trying to rediscover himself as this divine thing. And luckily, some master comes along, or someone who knows, and gives him directions, which we're supposed to take it as a kind of instruction on how to find himself or where he needs to go. And it made me think, at least in the commentary that's presented, it had at least in this respect a strong similarity with Stoicism, in particular the causes of error and ongoing misunderstanding. So to quote it, it says, "The thieves are the false ideas of merit and demerit." You know, we could call that what is choice-worthy, desirable, and things to be averse to. So yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting because the text talks about he's bound down to his cattle and his sons and daughters and wife and things like that, rather than, you know, so external things rather than this kind of similar approach of looking for something deeper, you know, this. And it seems like, I know, like you're saying, we should be careful about this. And I guess maybe we can also see this attempt you were talking about of finding a unifying mythology. We see it in Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy too, you know, this idea that there's a lot of similarity here, and maybe I make connections where they're not. So should be careful about that.
Well, I think everyone does, Courtney. That's the thing. That's why it didn't the I mean, you know more, but I don't know. I know nothing about this. You know about this. This is the wasn't a lot of the Hermetic tradition around finding common ground between the biblical traditions and the Greek traditions, right? You know, it was supposed that they really all had a common kind of basis, and I think naturally we gravitate to trying to find structures that make sense and that are coherent across these different systems. But I think you're absolutely right in specifically in relation to this, because he specifically says the blindfolded man who's completely confused, he doesn't know if he's happy or unhappy or intelligent or stupid. He knows nothing. He doesn't know how to live. And then he meets the Brahman Atman, who is free from slavery, happy, and in addition full of sympathy for others. So that's an element of the Brahman Atman's wisdom, is that he has this sympathy and this understanding. You know, his part of his knowledge and his wisdom is his fellow feeling for other people, which I thought was beautiful, and as you say, Courtney, quite reminiscent of Stoicism.
Yeah, and it kind of got me thinking more about the differences as I was going along reading this. And so I read this quote on the same page, I think. "I believe that I suffer." Apparently this is a quote from, I don't know, he doesn't really say where exactly. Maybe it's from some yoga text or something. It says, "I believe that I suffer. I believe that I'm bound. I desire liberation. At the moment when, having awakened, I understand that this I is a product of matter. I, at the same time, understand that all existence has been only a chain of moments of suffering, and that true spirit, impassively contemplated the drama of personality." It made me think about how miserable, again, this reminds me of Schopenhauer now, these philosophies are, because Gnosticism is pretty miserable too. And it's this idea that we've been born into, or our souls or whatever have made a mistake in being incarnated, and as a result we have to suffer as a result of it. But in Stoicism you don't see that. You see a similar interest in finding yourself or whatever, but you don't see it as a form of suffering. And I just jotted some quick notes to explain that. There seems to be, yeah, in this Indian one and the Gnostic one, there seems to be no interest in a rational view, that we're governed by our commitment to beliefs. If we eradicate incorrect beliefs, i.e. the ones that support the view that you can be constrained, oppressed, or harmed, and then you will not experience suffering. So no awakening of the cosmic self is necessary in the rational view, as the human life has all the order and perfection required for happiness. But because they don't have this rational kind of perspective in the Indian and the Gnostic versions that we're presented with here, the solution is the world is fucked. It's just a place of suffering, as opposed to it being, well, it's because you have beliefs about the world that support that particular view. I think that's a really interesting distinction, because it basically cuts out the need to come up with a cosmic self.
A separate cosmic self that exists without the world.
Or something that you need to kind of get back to desperately in order to become happy. Rather, you can say, well, no, I have a part of the divine whole in me, and that is the part in reason that allows me to alter my beliefs so that they align with nature in such a way that I no longer suffer. You don't have to become God. You just have to use reason properly.
Well, I think that's really interesting where he then goes back into the Platonist tradition, because obviously the Gnostic tradition owed a lot to the Platonist tradition one way or another, in kind of combination with Christianity as it was in its kind of first 150 years or 120 years or something. So in a sense, what he's done to date is a bit anachronistic, you know, because he hasn't given us the backstory, but here he's about to with the Platonism, or some of it.
Yeah, he says, he quotes Plotinus, right? Memory is for those who have forgotten, and that remembering is a virtue. And you already mentioned it, but it reminded me of the sage, right? He says a perfect memory is superior to the ability to recollect. And we know that in the Stoic sage, having attained virtue, he cannot experience a loss of virtue. There's no element of forgetting in the sage, which is quite interesting, because virtue is an unforgettable experience. The sage cannot forget, but we can. And this is where I'm kind of interested in drawing a very strange connection that may or may not be appropriate, that, you know, we forget. The sage doesn't, but we do. So we need methods of recollection, which are the techniques, the techne, you know. And there's this idea then that possibly, if it's appropriate to draw this connection, that in Stoicism, there's a constant ongoing need for recollection through pedagogy. That some things are up to us and some things are not. That's what's constantly being told to us, and we constantly need to remember it.
I think probably Eliade assumes that all his readers are going to be 100% familiar with the Platonist background, but just to kind of reiterate that, in the dialogue, the Meno, Socrates shows to his own and his listener's satisfaction through an experiment, which is a slave who isn't educated. He's just a young boy. He's brought forward, and Socrates shows him how to come to a conclusion about a geometrical problem. And from this, Socrates concludes that there was no way that the young boy could have known all this other than that it was a kind of recollection. And so I can't remember if he actually goes into the mechanism in the Meno, but he certainly goes into it in the Phaedo and later dialogues, where the mechanism is in fact that in a previous incarnation, that's where the soul has learnt some of these things, and therefore that's how we come to be able to carry out geometrical or sort of arithmetical calculations where we might have had no knowledge of them before. So memory plays that absolutely critical role in Platonist theory about understanding, learning, recognition, and it's just worth noting that that's how fundamental memory is to all the cognitive operations in Platonism.
Yeah, and more than just mathematical, right? And geometrical, it's truth, beauty, and goodness too are the kinds of forms that apparently the soul knows or has known and then recollects. Which reminds me, I wanted to ask you, is it that the soul, say when a person sees a beautiful woman or a flower or something like that, the idea is that that thing is beautiful because it partakes in the form of beauty? Does that mean that the recollection happens because beauty, well, that thing partakes in the form of beauty, so it's more of a kind of recognition? Or is it that the soul already knew it and this thing has the appearance of something that the soul already had? I like to think it's in the world.
Yeah, I think the former of what you said there, Courtney, is more my understanding of it. But yeah, I think that, the symposium is where the sort of theory of beauty is most elaborated, I would say. So I think that it's a participation in the form of beauty, I think. But yeah, the process of recognition is key. And of course, yeah, that implies some kind of original familiarity. So yeah.
Yeah, but more, I guess I asked that question because importantly, these things in the world all around us partake in truth, beauty, and goodness. They actually have that in them somehow, as opposed to they just somehow stand in for and remind us
Yeah.
of something. Because that would be too Cartesian in a sense. That would be.
Yeah, that's right. And you'd have an infinite regress of replicas, I suppose. And we don't want an infinite regress of replicas. So I would say participation is more the model.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that the human being is interacting with the world in order to discover the truth, right? Yeah.
Rather than just a recognition of the beautiful form inside, recognizing the abstract beautiful form
Yeah.
that's mediated between the sun and myself, the
like
sunset
an
and myself.
abstraction. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. So then he goes into the myth of Mnemosyne. I actually had to look that one up too. Mnemosyne. Mother of the Muses, who's omniscient or omniscient, depending on how you pronounce it. And the poets, when they're possessed by the Muses, draw directly from Mnemosyne's store of knowledge, especially from the knowledge of origins, of beginnings, and of genealogies. And this is really important for what Eliade is going to talk about. Yeah.
And I've just realized that's the kind of the theoretical and poetic way of saying what I said before, that you can't have culture without memory. As Eliade has put it, that Mnemosyne being the mother of the muses is exactly the kind of the poetic way of saying exactly that.
Yeah, and I really like what he does here. I can see why in that book, The Philosophy of Madness, the guy's interested in Eliade for this particular stuff, because reading between the lines, it's pretty interesting. Because he says, the past thus revealed is much more than the antecedent of the present, more than just a temporal frame. It is its source. It reaches, so in another word, it reaches the depths of being. There's this idea that to discover the original, the primordial reality from which the cosmos issued, and which makes it possible to understand becoming as a whole. So the poet has access to the original realities, mythical times of the beginning, no longer perceivable in current experience. Now, this is really cryptic, and I think it's really interesting. So it can resemble a contact with the other world. The past appears as a dimension of the beyond. That's really cool, eh? The past appears as a dimension of the beyond because it exists in a time. Because if we're interested in the origins to find the meaning of things in the now, it means because these things existed in some sort of primordial reality, they no longer have to bear any kind of direct representation to what we see or experience now, that they could be otherworldly in a sense. They could be myths or symbols, or they could be the world of the dead, or the world of madness. And obviously that's why the guy in Madness is interested. Mystical states of experiencing and things like that. I think this is really, there's a lot going on in the background here.
I think that's why it says it's no longer an antecedent. It's not like a mechanical causality or like just one step right before the next that had caused it. It's more like an upspring, a wellspring that's really sourced from something deep. And to understand the character of that is to also understand the force that all of that pressure from that origin has and emerges throughout your life.
Yeah. And I think, again, here's me doing things I shouldn't be doing, drawing connections from Stoicism to this. I think this is really interesting. If this is the case, then no wonder the Stoics are so interested in physics, physis. They're interested in this idea of fate and causality and things like that. And maybe that's the idea, that if they can get back to understanding this primordial time, the way the cosmos was formed and the way Zeus penetrated all of matter with his pneuma or whatever, and to know that is to explain exactly what's going on in the present moment. That's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason why he uses the expression here, descensus ad inferos, the descent to the underworld, because that's an absolutely key process. It's a key process in Homer. It's a key process in the Aeneid, the great Latin epic. Seneca has his moments where he refers a bit obliquely to a descent to the underworld. So yes, I think you're absolutely right, Courtney. I think broader culturally, it certainly was a wellspring of knowledge, or again, this penetration to other mediated ways of knowing.
And there was this idea in Cicero, I'm pretty sure I remember reading it, and I'm sure it's repeated elsewhere, that we tend to trust, or those guys tended to trust, like Pythagoras and that, because they were closer to the beginning of the cause of time. So the philosophy that they had was more pure or more perfect and less watered down and less problematic. Seneca says the same things, right? In a different way when he's talking, because if we take, like, Nussbaum recommends that but Stoicism kind of draws on a medical analogy. Well, do you remember that one? Oh, it must be in, I can't remember, you'll remember, one, maybe letter 91 or something, where Seneca's talking about back in the old days, where before men were corrupted by external things, cures were much simpler. There's this idea of, anyway, it's a slightly different thing, but it's just, again, that idea of getting back to the point in which history begins. There's a golden age and people were more perfect, and anyway, slightly different subject.
But that's why origin of cosmos matches origin of genealogies, because as you stretch your memory back into the past, your identity and how you understand, how you've inherited your identity, becomes more, it's less focused. You don't know the exact definitions, like which is why every time you look into the past, genealogy and cosmos, it becomes a more generalized, like, universal story, rather than recording your great grandparents. I related that to myself recently in a kind of Tower of Babel analogy, that my great grandfather didn't speak a language that any of us spoke. So we cannot have a genealogy going before that. And it even exists in a kind of like inside the British Empire, of like a totalizing, all in one language. So it's sort of, so you could use the analogy out of Babel, sort of comes the line of fathers that I understand, an identity that I understand from a grand mythic story.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you're getting past beyond where the story of history starts. Yeah. And which brings us to the second part, right? So this idea of genealogy and origins. The other one, the second version of this, is the myth of memory and forgetting change, he says, becomes enriched by the eschatological. There you go. Try and say that 10 times fast. Eschatological meaning when a doctrine of transmigration takes place. So eschatological, that's how you pronounce it, don't you? Eschatological meaning, which has to do with the end of things, doesn't it? Yeah, the end of humanity, or the end of one's life, soul, destiny of the soul. So in this, the function of lethe, have we introduced the concept of lethe? Am I jumping ahead here? Lethe is he says it's a fountain, but I googled it and it said it's a river in Hades. You would know, Judith. Is it a river or a fountain?
In my understanding, it's a river. But yeah, that could just be a turn of phrase. I wouldn't put too much weight on that.
So apparently, if you drink from Lethe, or however you pronounce it, you forget everything. You forget your life, your life of earthly existence. But in this second type of forgetting, the function of Lethe is reversed. He says it no longer finds forgetfulness of earthly life, but blots out the memory of the celestial world, of the soul returning to earth to be reincarnated. I don't know. Basically, instead of merely causing us to forget our earthly life that we just lived, it now, in this second formulation, blots out the memory of the celestial world once the soul returns to the earth as an incarnated thing. I thought that was quite interesting because it made me think of, and here's me getting all symbolic again, the paradox of this way of seeing life and death and forgetting and remembering. And it's this idea, like the serpent eating its tail. It's a kind of paradox, because on the one hand, you got life is the forgetting of the soul, the life of the soul. And so in becoming alive, we lose our immortality, so we experience a kind of death. But on the other hand, death is the forgetting of earthly existence. So there's this interesting kind of paradox at work within it that I thought would be really cool to probably eat a lot of magic mushrooms and think about. But anyway.
The second formulation makes sense in that once you enter the river of time, of chronos, of continuity, of moment to moment, the moment to moment contingency means you forget whatever is the eternal good.
Yeah. We're up to part 3. If anyone has anything else to say about that section. Do you want to add anything about Lethe, Judith? I don't know much about any of that. No. Lorraine? So you're raring to go?
I don't know much about it at all, Lethe.
You'll have to ask your mad patience about it.
Judith, in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is asked to cut the like to make a pool of the blood of the sheep so the shades remember, is it the opposite to Lethe?
Sorry, the opposite of what?
The opposite of drinking of the river of Lethe, of drinking of
maybe it is actually, Sam. I think you might be right. I think maybe it is. I can't think why else it would be. That seems to make sense.
It's almost so once Odysseus adds the material back in, the shades then recognize Odysseus again. They recognize his face.
Yeah.
His mother did not recognize him before that material was added back to the eternal.
Yeah, but it's also the corporeal being added back as well. It kind of triggers something, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why it's blood and breaking down matter.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, here's Kyle.
Hi, Kyle. Did you read this one?
No, not really.
No, there you go.
But I thought you might. I was interested.
Yeah, you've been missing a lot of interesting waffle about life and death. How do you say his name again? Is it? I've already forgotten. Anyone remember?
Mircea Eliade.
There you go. So we're at part 3, primordial and historical memory. So this got me waxing lyrical again. So Lethe is powerless in the case of certain privileged persons, he tells us, who inspired, there's like 2 cases, right? The ones who are inspired by the muses, or by virtue, so there's a second clause, or by virtue of a power of prophecy in reverse, which is that referring back to origins again, a really interesting point. Now, I thought this was really interesting because, do you remember in Therapy of Desire, I really got wound up on this idea that Nussbaum thought that all of the Hellenistic schools, in one form or another, she says, were interested in this kind of concept of liberating man from Tuki, which is the goddess of luck, So she kind of sets it up as techne versus taiki. You know, if we could only come up with a technique, a system of philosophy, a use of reason, logos, in order to liberate man from the machinations of luck, you know, and misfortune. But here we've got a different formulation, because here it's sort of lethe, or forgetfulness, is powerless in the case of people who have this particular virtue of a power of prophecy in reverse. So knowing, this is an interesting and a different way of saying a similar thing. Instead of being focused on techne, well, I think it still gets to that, but we're looking instead at this way of knowing the origins of things in such a way that it gives us power over taike in a different way. You know what I mean? Does anyone think that's an interesting connection, or am I just ranting and raving again? Otherwise, because I think that's so interesting, right? Like man or woman, you know, human beings go about their lives in ancient times totally, you know, like in the Homeric tradition, they're plucked up by the gods and they're thrashed around and they're driven mad and all these terrible things happen to them until they invent, you know, philosophy. Like this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to give man an escape route, you know, away from the vicissitudes of what it's like to be this incarnated thing. But anyway, the other option is what is it? Lethe is powerless for those who recollect their former lives. That's the other version, right? The ones who.
So in the symposium, or in many traditions, which one are they using? Are they using a recognition of love, like the Muses, or an alliance with noble character, with ideal character? I think sometimes they're doing both.
Yeah. Well, I think he says he Plato. He says something like Plato's aware of this, and he kind of changes it to suit his particular philosophy, but he's using kind of a bit of a mixture. But yeah, the first one's knowledge of origins, and the second one's knowledge of history or transmigrations. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Tim. Oh, that's okay. So so this is on page 124. And I did have a bit of trouble with this, I suppose. He says, we've already had occasion to compare Plato's philosophy with what could be termed archaic ontology. We must now show in what sense Plato's theory of ideas and the Platonic anamnesis can be compared with the attitude and behavior of man in archaic and traditional societies. The man in those societies finds in myths the exemplary models for all his acts. The myths tell him that everything he does or intends to do has already been done at the beginning of time. Sorry, just going up to the top of the next one. In illo tempore, which means in that time. Hence, myths constitute the sum of useful knowledge. And so, and then the next paragraph, he summarizes, for Plato, living intelligently, that is, learning to know and knowing the true, the beautiful, and the good, is above all remembering a discarnate, purely spiritual existence. So I guess what Eliade is doing here is aligning a view of the Platonist viewpoint with one particular kind of, you know, what he likes to refer as archaic ontology, or what we might imagine to be the traditional, I guess, pre-literate understanding. Although, you know, it's hard to be sure about what a pre-literate understanding will be like, because by definition, we don't know what that is.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what we were trying to get at before, that this idea of these archaic models being interested not in personal history, but in the former version, which is access to knowledge of the origins, and that those mythological stories provide everything for the primitive man in the now to understand how to conduct himself. without recourse to great men, great deeds, great events, or anything like that.
Which I thought makes sense if primitive man is about a continuance. They don't really perceive a future. They perceive life as it is and should be, and only when the bottom falls out. Like,
yeah. And it's more impersonal, right? Like I'm when I was reading this, I don't know much about indigenous myths, but like for example, the rainbow serpent, right? Like, and I'm going to butcher this, but basically, instead of say our normal, or not normal, that's the wrong word. Instead of say our Greek myths where there's some great hero that we're supposed to emulate, for example, maybe, or learn lessons from, instead there's these cosmic forces that carve up the land and they make rivers, and then human beings are given like well, they just happen to accidentally be there probably, but now they've taken on as their role to look after those sacred places left by these ancient cosmic beings or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's quite different, but it in a different way it tells the group what their duties and roles are in relation to the environment and things like that. Oh, by the way, Judith, I looked that up because I don't speak Latin. In illo tempore, and guess what the internet said? It said used by Eliade to denote the time before recorded history. So apparently it's specific to him. And
well, it's not specific to him because, it's kind of like a, but anyway, it's interesting that he's the kind of the paradigm usage of it.
Well,
but just
in a sense, it's technical, right? He's saying the time before
that's
recorded
right.
history. Yeah.
Well, yeah. In that, I mean, literally all it means is in that time. But by that he means a particular and not very well defined period. But so just going back to this idea of so it's really hard. I suppose what is really hard to understand is this what all the observances of the so-called pre-literate person might be, or what it might mean, and just to observe that even in historical times. So, for instance, in Herodotus or in Plutarch or in Pausanias, they record myths and ceremonial activities in different locations that nobody understands. Nobody knows why they do this, but they just do it. So in a sense, myth is also reinforced and enacted by ritual without necessarily understanding what the origins or the basis of the observance might be. So that's another aspect of and maybe that's an example of forgetting, right? It's just people going through the motions, and that's what's so mysterious about illo tempore in that time, that mysterious pre-literate, pre-recorded ancestral environment is kind of a blur, really, and yeah.
But in some ways, it's forgetting yourself or your individual self, or forgetting your own personal continuity, to then fall back into your cultures, like sort of wellspring, the core that's unidentified, that's before your specificity, that gets in the way of your culture. So then you're forgetting that to stop fighting it, to say the Americans pledge allegiance to the flag. But like they're busy mythologizing and ritualizing their origin story all the time.
Yeah, it's prior to history in that sense. Yeah. So, and then he says, in Plato, we find not a forgetting of personal experiences. This is how Plato apparently changes and shapes these two ideas. So he's not forgetting personal experiences of reincarnation. That's not what it's about. But instead, it's a forgetting of transpersonal and eternal truths that's going on. Then he goes on to say that philosophical anamnesis does not recover the memory of events belonging to previous lives, but of truths. That is, the structures of the real. Thought that was really interesting. Because, of course, it makes me think of the Stoics and this idea of discovering the truth, the structures of the real. you know, and instead of doing, you know, they see themselves obviously as the proper followers of Socrates, but rather than doing what Plato does and talking about, you know, this journey of the soul from the world of wherever to here and the forgetting and all that, they're nonetheless concerned with a different formulation of that, one that definitely employs a lot of the knowledge of origins, but that understanding of origin achieves the same sort of things, which is a kind of philosophical anamnesis. But, and again, it's exactly towards the same goal, to discover the truths, the structures of the real. Yeah.
Well, that's what again, what Marcus Aurelius is doing when he enjoins us to strip back everything to its elements, because that's the only way we understand, or we can see what something actually is. And to it's a form of approaching the real.
Absolutely. And he says, for example, do not make yourself a tumor on the cosmos. And the way I understand that is to create this fantasy bubble around yourself that's completely disconnected with the real, you know. Yeah. So we're at part 4, sleep and death. That's what I plan to do tonight.
Just to come back to I get sort of hung up on the structures of the real. Because what does that allude to? I mean, and we've kind of said not the material. So we sort of did away with matter earlier on. So what is the real? Is it the spiritual? That there's something, and that holds true content? So is it just in words? Words true content? Is it that
definitely
it's spoken into existence?
Yeah, well, definitely in Plato, right? Well, forget about the Stoics for a second, obviously, but in Plato, right? Like that's what Judith and I was sort of trying to work out before she was but it's the idea that the real is a kind of spiritual dimension, and the real is this idea that the world itself is partaking in the spiritual world in such a way that, say, for example, you see something that moves you and it's beautiful, it's because that object partakes in the eternal form of the beautiful, for example, which doesn't itself exist as a thing that the incarnated human being can experience, but it somehow uses objects as a kind of doorway through which it discloses itself to us, to use those sort of phenomenological words. And through that disclosure, we're reminded, or we recollect the fact that, that's right, I'm actually not from here.
And there's a gradation, and in the symposium. Why don't we read the symposium again? I think we've done it twice now, but we can always do it again. But basically, there's a gradation. So we start off appreciating beautiful bodies, then we appreciate beautiful souls, and ultimately, should we proceed further, we're appreciating the forms of the beautiful. And so it's the Platonist view is a view that most people most of the time aren't actually accessing the real, in a sense. So, and that's why it's called an idealist worldview. That it maintains that the most real and true things are actually somehow beyond or somehow above, and it's through a process that ultimately we'll be in contact with them, or that we recognize, as Courtney says, that what we're perceiving is participating or replicating to some extent the forms of these things, but what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis are not actually the real.
Plato kind
of says, it's pretty out there.
Yeah, it is. But it's really important for the history of Western thought, really, isn't it? Because we have, after Plato, basically he says once you're in a body, the senses obscure the reality of things. And so I think the translation in the Jowett anyway, he says it's as if we see through a glass half darkly. I think that's quite a famous phrase, isn't it? But anyway, the idea is that we can do certain things like whatever it is, maybe it's rituals or philosophy or something that causes us to clear away the cobwebs over our eyes. So there's all this mythology and symbolism, like Eliade gets into it a little bit, about curing blindness, for example. And it's kind of symbolic of the idea that if only you could see the truth, you would see the divine world, and it would be shining through flowers and beautiful bodies, and through our institutions, and through the kindness that strangers show to one another. You would see the mark of the divine. So the idea is that, Plato's talking like this, but then the Neoplatonists take it up in a much more serious way, and they come up with all this kind of mysticism, that there are certain things that you can do in order to get closer to the divine. And then you end up with all these things like theurgy. I think they might have already existed much before that. But then you get Christianity. Like if you read St. Augustine, which we once read, remember, the Confessions, Augustine talks about going through a process with his understanding of Platonism, where he made it all the way up to the top echelons of the rational level, and he still could not transcend himself and find the realm of the divine, and so he gave himself over to God. And he said he lost himself, and he became whatever, had this experience that he thinks that Plato's trying to talk about, but only through Christianity was he able to achieve it. So you get this whole tradition of this mystical abnegation of the self, and this kind of self-sacrifice to God, basically. It definitely takes on that kind of tenor as it goes on through the traditions, right?
Yeah, that's right. And obviously Christianity took up this Platonist idea and kind of ran with it, such that there was this rejection of the body. So it's kind of the polar opposite. So, it's so interesting that the Stoics also thought they were inheriting Platonism, but they quite, I would say, originally and practically embraced the corporeal as the real, whereas this other strand, which the Christians ran with, disregarded or denigrated the corporeal, the body, and that's the Gnostic tradition that Eliade started with. And that, there were these two twin kind of strands coming out of Platonism that were quite diametrically opposed, but in a sense the idealist strand was completely influential and completely compatible with Christian thought.
Yeah.
Indeed, how nice is it that those two strands reflect hypnos and thanatos, like dissolving of the body / the dream of the ideal.
Very well put, Sam. Yes.
And if you read Nietzsche, because we know you love your existentialists, he talks about the despisers of the body, and he's really talking about this whole tradition, isn't he? So yeah, sorry, part 4, sleep and death. Hypnos is brother to Thanatos. I forgot that. That's cool. Great connection. And here
twins as well.
Oh, are they? Well, there you go. He says, awakening has taken on a soteriological meaning. It's been a while since we've used that word in this group. Soteriological. I know it's Kyle's favorite word. Go on, Kyle, remind us what it is. He's forgotten.
Salvific.
Yes, salvific. Nicely done. So Socrates awakens those. I love this bit. Socrates awakens those who talk with him, even though against their will, Eliade says, which I think is interesting. We could argue about that, no doubt. But it's definitely his intention and his technique, right? Because I was thinking about his method. He has the protreptic and the elenchus, and then the Stoics add dogma. And the reason they do that, of course, is they see logos as causative. They can use it as a kind of power in itself, I guess. Well, it is a form of argument. But I guess the other thing you can say about that too is that yeah, it forces the witness to confront themselves and to see their own inconsistencies. And that's definitely going, if a person is at least open to listening, they're going to be pushed against their will to some degree, whether they like it or not. Do you kind of follow that, Judith, or you change it up?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. People are, yeah, Socrates does kind of compel people, doesn't he? His procedure it brings them against their will to recognize their own contradictions or contradictions in what they believe. So yes,
He's the
yeah, it's a
original
form of,
exorcist.
yeah, that's right. It's the form of awakening, but not necessarily a pleasant one.
Yeah. Did you want to say any more about Socrates there? Because I kind of skipped ahead here to the hymn of the pearl.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting because I looked up the Hymn of the Pearl, and it was a beautiful little sort of narrative poem. Uh, and he kind of gives the story here, but it could have been written by someone whose name escapes me, but I did write it in the Facebook group, who was a holy man active in Edessa in Syria, which of course was the location of our reading of about Elagabalus. So, and this writer may have met with Indian holy men who all came as a deputation to visit Elagabalus. So it was a kind of an amazing coincidence. But obviously this is a very kind of symbolic poem about the prince who goes away, goes to another country, goes to another culture. Of course, it's Egypt, which is the location of ancient ancestral wisdom. And then he forgets. He forgets what he came for. He forgets his mission. He forgets what it was he was tasked with doing.
And we were having a conversation the other night, Judith and I, with a Stoic group that were talking about how just and appropriate it would be to be angry because you're being oppressed. And there's a line in this that captures it entirely. He says, because of the burden of their oppression, I lay in a deep sleep. So, yeah, there's no excuse, not in this tradition at least. Yeah, sure, it's Gnostic, but I think all these sort of traditions are kind of making very similar claims, especially around what belongs to you, what's more important, and what's less important. And obviously, in all these stories, the world of becoming, the external world, is not um, is not the kind of thing that one makes more important than their own whatever, their own self, their own agency, their own part and reason, or whatever it is.
I was also going to suggest that since the Gnostics have inherited a Moses story, that in that Jewish and Christian tradition, they consider Egypt both bondage and like a passage into like under the earth, into a world that's like more bound by the forces of man and therefore more bound by death. And they also, so they've inherited a parallel between death and bondage in being taken to Egypt. That's why the song goes, Moses goes down to Egypt.
Cool. And he gives us a bunch of examples from the Gnostics. And we mentioned this earlier on about how the soul burns with desire to experience the body, and that's how it gets into trouble in the first place. And we have the Apocryphon of John. He quotes, "Let him who hears wake from a heavy sleep. And again, the messenger who wakes man from his sleep brings him both life and salvation. I love this bit. I am the call of awakening from sleep in the aeon of the night." Mate, if I was Batman, that's what I'd be saying right before I beat up a baddie. And guess what? It was by some guy called Hippolytus, and it's from the refutation of the heresies, which I ended up downloading a PDF of. It's pretty long, but it's awesome. And it turns out Hippolytus may in fact be Origen, and it might be a book an early book by Origen. Have you ever looked at it, Judith? It's really,
No, I haven't.
really interesting. It's like it's a blow by blow account of every heresy according to this Hippolytus, and it goes through all the Greek, well, not all of them, but the Greek traditions, Epicurus, the Stoics, and it's sort of in chronological order. It goes through astrology, it goes through various Christian heresies. It's incredible, but it's a couple hundred pages long. But I reckon it would be I don't know, like it would be a hard one to discuss though. It'd just be like, oh, wasn't chapter 7 great, you know? Because each chapter is just a chunk of text. It's like paragraph, paragraph, paragraph. You'd love it, Kyle.
Oh, I've just got to, I mean, and I think, yes, I think Hippolytus is one of these sources for the Stoics, right? He's a late source for is he a hostile source or is he a sympathetic source?
Hostile, I think. Yeah,
hostile, okay. But yeah, so he's a source. Yeah. And because we can't be choosy about our sources, we've got to go with the hostile ones. So just to make a point about aeon, well, aeon is Greek for eternity, era. It's a word that occurs constantly in Marcus Aurelius. So yeah, it's a preoccupation. You know, this idea about time.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? I am the call of awakening from sleep in the aeon of the night. Mate, that's awesome. Sam, remember that one next time you're on a date? Pull that one out. And then he says on page 130, it is significant here that overcoming sleep and remaining awake for a long period is typical of initiatory ordeals. And again, I was drawing connections that I probably shouldn't draw. It made me think about staying awake in that psychological sense, because the Stoics are all about vigilance, about not falling asleep on your watch, you know, that you're constantly on guard, constantly watchful, not letting any sneaky impression steal its way inside and take over your power of reasoning. So that's a kind of wakefulness. And he says,
think there he does in this section, he does get a bit, you know, like, and here we find this, and here we find that. It's kind of a bit like that, you know. He mentions the North American myth of the Orpheus and Eurydice type. Well, you know, maybe, but without being able to verify these things ourselves, we're kind of yeah, as I say, we've just got to be a little bit careful about this kind of thing.
You're right. That style really reminded me of Fraser's Golden Bough, because I read that when I was a kid, and it was just like, and then this tribe, and then that tribe, and then that tribe. Yeah, yeah. But then he says, remaining awake means being fully conscious, being present in the world of the spirit. And again, I thought about the Stoics and thought, well, yeah, and also you could reframe it as remaining awake, prosoche, means being fully conscious, being present in the world, in our world. Yeah. So then we get more into this. We got to a point where I started cooking dinner at this point, and this was my second read through. But the kids were coming home soon, and they expected their spaghetti on the table. And I remember it kind of deteriorates into a bit more Gnosticism and Indian stuff. So you guys will have to tell me what happened next.
Well, again, we have a bit of this kind of, you know, random quotes plucked out of context. And this is where I start to think, yeah, it's a bit kind of, it's a bit, you know, key to all the mythologies kind of stuff, and there's no parameters, and yeah, we're at so for instance, the top of page 133, as we have seen, Indian philosophical speculation, especially Samkhya yoga, takes a similar position. Well, it's like, okay, we have to take your word for it because we don't know that text, we don't know the context, and so it's a bit like, how are we to know how to evaluate these claims?
So
But
was
anyway,
that
he kind of summarizes and he says, for the purpose of our investigation, the importance of the Gnostic myth, as also the importance of Indian philosophical speculation. And this is a big statement to find the significance of the whole of Indian philosophical speculation, lies primarily in the fact that they reinterpret man's relation to the primordial drama that brought him into being. So, as in the archaic religions studied in the preceding chapters, for the Gnostic too, it is essential to know, or rather to recollect, the drama that took place in mythical times, in illo tempore. But unlike a man of the archaic societies, who learning the myths assumes the consequences that follow from these primordial events, the Gnostic learns the myth in order to disassociate himself from its results. So that's interesting, if he's accurate about that, maybe. Once waked from his mortal sleep, the Gnostic, like the disciple of Samkhya Yoga, understands that he bears no responsibility for the primordial catastrophe that the myth narrates for him, and that hence he has no real relation with life, the world, and history. So, well, that kind of seems though it might be accurate, I guess, because, again, I'm not really, I haven't read much about Gnosticism, but what I have read is this kind of radical rejection of the world, rejection of everything that most people think is actually going on. It's a kind of it's almost a radical conspiracy theory about reality, that somehow or other we have to transcend the world that we find ourselves in, and that's the only way
it's
out.
very similar to Manichaeism, isn't it? Because my understanding, I could be completely wrong, and there's probably different versions anyway, but there's this idea that there's a god that created, I think, I can't remember, created the demiurge or something, who's this sort of Satan figure, I guess, and that creature that then decided to create the world, and it created a reality, but that reality being that it wasn't God who created it imperfectly. So the material world that we inhabit is basically corrupt and evil, and we live in a corrupt and evil place. That's kind of the Gnostic idea. And so some of the Gnostics apparently was so stink on living in the world and being alive that they'd starve themselves to death because they saw eating food as a form of maintaining the corruption of the body, and obviously they resisted sexual intercourse and things like that. So not a bunch of happy chappies.
And there's a mythological structure that they sometimes use, that this demiurge creating the material world therefore means a snake in their origin story is actually a Christ-like figure, not necessarily a tempter, but someone to tell you wisely, oh, look, you're trapped in bondage. You're trapped in this material world, and you're being prevented from taking the abstract, from taking the forbidden fruit, from taking the higher, more idealized things. You should take it. It belongs to you, and they put you in here.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, we should look into Gnosticism one day. I've got Pierre Hadot's book on Plotinus. One day we've got to read that. But anyway. So what else?
So
is that the end?
No, anamnesis and historiography. I thought this was really interesting, actually, and it's interesting partly because Herodotus, being the sort of the first Greek historian we know about, he was also someone who liked to pluck, myths from over here, from Persia or whatever, from Egypt, and bring it all together in alignment with what the Greeks are saying. And so this impulse to align and coordinate and see resemblances goes right back to Herodotus in the Western tradition. But yeah, as Eliade says, Herodotus wishes to preserve the memory of what the Greeks and barbarians did. And so, yeah, that's what we're doing, right? It's what we're looking at, the Greeks and the barbarians. And so, as he says, it is not within the scope of this essay to examine the various philosophies of history, from Augustine and Giacomo da Fiore never heard of that person, to Vico, Hegel, Marx, and the contemporary historicists. All these systems set out to discover the meaning and direction of universal history. But that is not our problem. What is of interest to our investigation is not the meaning that history may have, but historiography itself. In other words, the endeavor to preserve the memory of contemporary events and the desire to know the past of humanity as accurately as possible. And as he points out, this kind of curiosity has developed over time. And he says from the 19th century on that historiography has been led to play a role of primary importance. And as he acknowledges, we're witnessing a vertiginous widening of the historical horizon. So we're not only looking at a kind of a linear progression of history, we're looking outwards and we're looking across the whole world nowadays. But that is not all. Through this historiographic anamnesis, man enters deep into himself. If we succeed in understanding a contemporary Australian, I think he meant an Aboriginal contemporary Australian, or his homologue, a Paleolithic hunter, we have succeeded in awakening in the depths of our being the existential situation and the resultant behaviour of a prehistoric humanity. So that's what his project is, ultimately to understand people, even pre-literate people, or pre-cultures that we have a kind of a resemblance to.
But doesn't he say he's sort of taking that former one, isn't he? He's saying we want to understand the origin story, you know, this genealogy, the not the personal history, but
the wellspring of the wellspring.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I've often wondered, and you know, I don't think there's an answer to it, but I've often wondered why Stoicism's so interesting now. And yeah, you're right, it's had resurgences in previous times, like the Enlightenment and in the establishment of America and things like that, I guess. But like now, you know, people seem to be really interested in these things, and in my weird way of thinking, I thought, well, something about the zeitgeist, you know, like it's alive again because we need it. We need to broaden our historical horizons to go back to the beginning of our cultural roots, so that we hopefully don't. Well, we've become too decadent or whatever, you know what I mean, and we need to refresh the spirit of the West again, or something like that, you know.
And I see that project spread out further than Eliade recognizes in the 60s, you know, through historiographical memory. Now, if he lived 20 more years, it would also go into evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. What is the mind and the forming of the mind that belongs to the pre-city people that all people, you know, develop through? Why are we like this, such that we build cities, such that we build our cultures? What shaped us? That's another modern source that people are looking at.
Can I just say, I really don't think we should read The Selfish Gene, because I'm trying to read it at the moment and it's really bad. So let's not go too much further with evolutionary biology,
No,
please.
I can't do that either. Sorry. So what's next? Sorry, we derailed you again, Judith.
We're nearly there. We're nearly at the end. It's been, I like this length of text. It's kind of manageable. So how does he conclude? He says the historiographic anamnesis of the Western world is only beginning. At least several generations must pass before its cultural repercussions can be gauged. But we may say that, though on a different plane, this anamnesis continues the religious evaluation of memory and forgetfulness. To be sure, neither myths nor religious practices are any longer involved. But there is this common element, the importance of precise and total recollection of the past. So I think you're absolutely right, Sam. I think if he'd continued for another 20 years, he would have taken the whole evolutionary perspective on board. It's actually a little bit surprising that he is without any kind of consciousness of any evolutionary perspective.
I think it's because he's a professor of religion and mythologies. You know, maybe he's more biased to the idea of the spirit. But you know, what you just read there really kind of makes me double down in a way. And I really think, imagine if this is a total imaginary thing. No one could ever know. But imagine if the ancient Stoics could see what we're doing here now with Stoicism. You know, they'd probably have a heart attack. But on the other hand, it's incredible what modern researchers have done from a bunch of fragments. You know, it's incredible. And that's anamnesis, right? Really, it's a massive effort to recollect or to remember something from the past, and there's a lot of filling in the gaps and reading between the lines. I think it's fascinating.
Well, I think that's what we're doing all the time when we do any historical research or any attempt to reconstruct anything. That's what we're doing. We're kind of doing an anamnesis of using the limited materials that we have.
But that's also just true of how we remember history, how you remember the character of your grandparents. You know, you remember these fragments and you remember these stories, and then almost like children, even through the fragments as signposts, you play out a game, you dance. You know, you play house like you've seen it played before, but by an observation of the fragments. But they're heart memories that let you dance through them in a ritual.
But then is that memory or construction? You know, so this is the thing, right? And this is what we're getting at. Like, for example, if we're talking about historical anamnesis to reconstruct something like Stoicism, we would hope that what we're doing is a what's the word, like an accurate recollection as opposed to a reconstruction, you know, that is completely different from what they meant in the first place.
But that's where these things get really interesting, you know. If you go to Pompeii, the whole amphitheater has been reconstructed. In fact, it was done under Mussolini. So, and yet you go there and you think, oh, this is how it would have looked in Roman times. Well, maybe. So yeah, anamnesis, recollection, memory, and reconstruction are all intertwined, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. That's what I was saying before. Is recollection the same thing as recognition, or is it reconstruction? You know, there's this blurring of the real, in a sense. What is the real? Like, Lorraine, I think that was the theme for you. Like, there's this certainty around the real, but it's actually not that certain at all, is it?
Yeah.
Doesn't that have a pragmatic answer? The real is what lets you persist. What lets you recombine through the, you know, construction, through the changes. If the real persists, like the real is you tomorrow after you die and sleep tonight.
I thought the real was a spiritual dimension where the form of beauty, the truth, and the good exist, and it could be experienced directly.
That's the question.
Well, is that it?
That's it. It's been a wonderful discussion, actually. It's such a fruitful and multivalent kind of theme.
I really liked it too, I just want to say, because I think this is the kind of thing where you can have really fruitful discussion. It's I don't think there's any real like right or wrong with it, you know. Sometimes it's like, well, that's a fact. Well, this is obviously a lot of there's a creative element here too, you know. There's a putting together of various stories and trying to find some common themes. And the common themes are themes I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in the kind of existential theme of forgetting and recollection and the return cycle and stuff like that. And I think Eliade is interested in that return cycle too, because I was reading about it in another book. So I look forward to reading more about him. And other people, do you want to say something in closing?
I agree with Judith that this is a very nicely sized text that is dense enough and fruitful and flavored enough to have a lot of directions to go with a thread. It's very digestible.
Yeah, I need to find some more short ones. I was looking at Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, but it's 200 pages, so probably not. Lorraine, any final thoughts, words, Kyle?
No, not really. I enjoyed it, and yes, I agree. I think it's a good size text, so that you can sort of get into some detail. Because otherwise, if it's too long, I find that I can't get into the nitty-gritty bits, you know. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Oh, wonderful. And that's really, you've helped me to recollect how important it is to choose appropriately when it comes to text for the reading group. So we'll be on the hunt for some more good ones. Maybe Seneca next time. Well, it was lovely talking to you guys. I actually really look forward to it, and I really enjoy our conversations. It means a lot to me. So enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Adios.
Thanks, Sol. Bye.
Bye.